Morning. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. We're a nonpartisan think based in Philadelphia, and I'm thrilled to kick off the very first of our First State series, which is a collaboration and a joint partnership between the University of Delaware and FPRI. And we have a terrific event this morning for you, which is the discussion of the ecological value of America's soft power. Our moderator this morning is Dr. Salim Ali, and his guest is FPRI's own Robert Strauss-Hupé Chair in Geopolitics, Robert D. Kaplan. I'd like to welcome our University of Delaware community, faculty, students, and friends of the University of Delaware, as well as our own members and supporters of FPRI, without whom we could not bring you events like this. Dr. Ali is an environmental security scholar whose research and practice focuses on the many ways of resolving ecological conflicts through technical and social mechanisms, as well as exploring novel ways of peace building between corporations, governments, and communities. That sounds like a tall task. He holds the Blue and Gold Distinguished Professorship in Energy and the Environment at the University of Delaware, and is also Senior Fellow at Columbia's University's Center on Sustainable Investment. In addition to his academic roles, Professor Ali serves on the 7-member science panel of the Global Environment Facility, which is the world's largest multilateral trust fund for the environment held in trusteeship by the World Bank. And he's on the United Nations International Research Panel. He's also been a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, and he's undertaken policy research assignments with New America and the Stimson Center. He has books, including Treasures of the Earth, Need, Greed, and Sustainable Future, Environmental Diplomacy, Islam and Education, Conflict and Conformity in Pakistan's Madrasas, and numerous anthologies. He also serves on the editorial board of the Review of Middle East Studies. He clearly has an illustrious career and background, and we're very pleased to be able to host this with Dr. Ali. I also want to do a couple of housekeeping things, which is to tell you all that we have a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So if you have questions in the course of the discussion, please by all means put your questions there and feed them to us. There will be a question and answer period at the end. So without further ado, I am delighted to turn over the reins to Dr. Salim Ali.
Thank you very much, Raleigh. It's indeed a privilege to host this inaugural event, which we hope will be the first of many collaborations between the University of Delaware and FPRI. We're especially grateful to Bob Torgerson, who's based in Delaware and on the FPRI board and has supported this initiative. It's really a particularly personal honor for me to host Robert Kaplan, whose work I have followed for the last 20 years. My first encounter with him was in 1994 when his landmark article, The Coming Anarchy, came out. And I was just starting my graduate degree in environmental studies at Yale. And that very year, the US Department of Defense partnered with the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies to host a conference which was prompted partly by this article. It was really quite illuminating for me coming, fresh out of college and learning about all these various intersecting factors and seeing that the environment was not just a soft issue, but it had some salience to hard politics. And so from there, seeing his trajectory over that period and his publications, which have touched so many fields, he's really a panoramic scholar. And apart from his writing, he's also a global strategist. He has served on the Defense Policy Board. So he's someone who has been very much in the halls of government, giving advice, and not just writing from his desk in the Berkshires. So it's really wonderful that you're able to now have this role at FPRI, Bob, where you are able to have that big picture thinking and share it with academics and students and other interested citizens. So your most recent book, which I'm going to ask you the first question about, and then we'll have a conversation and see how it evolves organically. Your most recent book, this is your 19th book, I take it, is called The Good American, and it hasn't yet been released. And The Good American is essentially a biography of someone who is not very well known. And for me, that was also very refreshing. As a reader of George Eliot, one of my favorite books is Middlemarch. And at the end of Middlemarch, there is a line about the story of this woman who was also not very well known, Dorothea. And at the end of the book, there's a line which says, the growing good of the world is largely made up of unhistoric acts. And all those incremental things, which we may sometimes refer to as soft power, the kind of work that this humanitarian, Bob Gersony, whom you write about as the Good American, that he did, how it connected with so many different ecologies and issues around the world. And yet he has not been given as much credit as now hopefully he will get from your book. I think it's a really landmark accomplishment to have that sense of attention to someone who otherwise might have been ignored. So my question to you is, how do you see the work of Gersony and its impact in the context of the high politics that the United States is, of course, much more known for? And particularly if you can comment on how that relates to some of your earlier insights about environmental determinism, for example, from your book, Revenge of Geography, which I might add with some caution has been critiqued a lot in the geography literature as being too environmentally deterministic. So how would you reconcile these two aspects of the hard power and the soft power from the insights of Gersony's work?
Well, first of all, Salim, it's a pleasure to be here virtually at the University of Delaware and at FPRI. Thank you so much for that generous introduction with all its specifics. And yes, I very much want to talk about this book. If I had to be defined by any one book, it would be this book. This is the most important book that I feel that I've ever done. And it's a biography of the greatest humanitarian you've never heard of. And that was the point of it. That, you quoted George Eliot in Middlemarch, that, the world evolves because of unhistoric acts that I might add occur outside the parameters of the news headlines. And Bob Gersony lived his life outside the parameters of the news headlines, but yet changing the world at the same time. And one of the reasons he was able to do this, one of the ways that he was essentially a relief worker, spending his life interviewing refugees and displaced persons, living out of a sleeping bag. And yet he had extraordinary access to secretaries of state, assistant secretaries of state, and others. In other words, to high policy. And the point of this is that for the 40 years that he worked for the State Department, for the US Agency for International Development, and occasionally for the UN, was a period when people at the bottom had access to people at the top, where the State Department and USAID particularly had access to the granular knowledge of individuals. Because one of the banes of Washington, which is in fact an imperial capital, governing what is in practice an imperial power, even if it's not officially declared as such, is that the problem with imperial powers is they seem to see the world in shadows. They don't know the specifics of what is going on in a particular place at a particular time. They have the illusion of knowledge where none actually exists. And that's what gets them into trouble. It got the US into trouble in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and a myriad other places that are much less newsworthy. What Gersony did was he brought that granular ground level knowledge to the eyes of policymakers, and he changed history as a result. He got the Reagan administration not to give aid to the Renamo guerrillas in Mozambique in 1988. Because from Washington, Renamo was seen as just freedom fighters. But Gersony, who interviewed hundreds of refugees on the ground in Mozambique and neighboring countries, knew they were anything but. They were a bunch of murderers. So, Washington worked in those years. It was able to, there was a pathway for granular knowledge to get to the top, in other words. And that became less so in the post-Cold War, essentially. So in a sense, Gersony's time is in a way past, and that's tragedy. There's an illusion of knowledge where none actually exists. And going along with that is there's more ideology in the system now. It seems ironic to say, but the State Department under Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, because of the particular character and personality of the Secretary of State, George Shultz, was basically non-ideological. Shultz was dedicated to the Foreign Service. He really heavily softened the edges of Reagan's ideology in application around the world. And it was a time where neoconservatives got along great with Arabists, where all these divisions that emerged with the Iraq War didn't exist. So I quote people in the book who are all on the same side of an issue, who are today are enemies and don't even talk to each other, essentially. So the key takeaway about Gersony's career is that he was able to unite different factions by coming to Washington with real news, what was really, really going on the ground. And one of the things that he discovered that was going on on the ground, is that environmental factors affect political decision making. It was indirect. It was outside the parameters of the news headlines, but it worked. That wherever there was war, there was also, loss of nutrients in the soil. There were water shortages. That all these things interacted in complex ways, and that he was able to bring to the table and to recommend courses of action.
That's great. Thank you so much, Bob. Now, just building on that, in terms of how you see the America First doctrine that has now gained ascendance, I wonder what you would reflect on in terms of Gersony's view as a humanitarian, where was he really thinking of this as doing well by doing good, or was there a more altruistic element to his vision of America's role in the world?
His basic outlook was, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Because often in these policy situations, you had people, even back then as now, offering up perfect solutions that were impractical. And the result was nothing got done, or what got done was destructive. And so it was really, he always had modest proposals. He knew you couldn't get 100%. You had to compromise, because that's just the way complex government works. And the best example of this was in the Yugoslav War in the 1990s, where there was a faction of very, very influential people who believed that you had to force the different ethnic groups to live together after the war ended, because that was the only right, correct, moral way. They had to discard their ethnocentrism, and you had to have villages where Croats lived with Serbs, with Bosnian Muslims. And Gersony, after interviewing hundreds of people on the ground in Bosnia and parts of Croatia, came to a different conclusion, which is that that's a nice thing to say, but it's not going to work in practice, because we've just had a war, a vicious ethnic war, where where tens of thousands of people were killed, hundreds of thousands by some estimates. And people are not just going to forget what happened to them during this horrible ethnic conflict. You're not going to get a few Croat families to move back into a village that was now all Serb. You could tell them that you'd pay for them, but they would throw your money in your face and simply not do it. Because who would protect the children at school when they go to school? Who would protect their houses at night? Gersony was the master of the mundane. He thought as average people thought about their own problems. Because he was the master of the mundane, he understood that you first had to get majority villages back together and if people were only comfortable living with their own ethnic group, you had to help them do that. You had to get people out of displaced persons camp and into towns and villages again. And if you did it by creating ethnic cantons, that was imperfect, but it moved things forward at least a bit. And it was this same philosophy of the mundane that made him cognizant of issues of water shortages and things like that.
Indeed. Now, just since you were on the topic of the Balkans, to give it a contemporary flavor, I was wondering if you can comment on the recent signing in the Oval Office of the economic diplomacy agreement between Kosovo and Serbia. Do you see this as having some broader resonance? Is this much more transactional, or do you see some greater promise in this?
It's a positive step. It is transactional, but sometimes you could get to a good place through transactional motives. If both sides see a transactional purpose in doing the same thing, well, that's progress, essentially. Here's the problem, though, in the structural problem for the Balkans. I mean, the former Yugoslavia is now called the Western Balkans. That's the politically correct phrase, but it's really the former Yugoslavia plus Albania. That's what we're really talking about here, is that these different, entities and groups have very different opinions about where their borders should be, where their rights could be. And ethnic politics have continued. The Yugoslav War of the 90s has continued without the shooting. People's attitudes have not evolved very, very much. And the only solution really is what I call the benevolent imperial influence of the European Union. The European Union is an empire in all but name. It's only partially democratic. It's ruled by elite bureaucrats from Northwestern Europe. People in Bulgaria, in Greece, in Poland are supposed to follow everything they say. That's imperial, essentially. Now, the problem is that the European Union had plans to extend its mandate through the former Yugoslavia and Albania, so that the whole of the Balkans would become integrated in the EU, because Bulgaria and Romania are already in the EU. The only part left out are these countries of the former Yugoslavia and Albania. And because under the EU umbrella, you can solve a lot of these national border problems. Because people would not be making a deal with each other, but they would be making agreements with the EU. essentially. So it would be like a technocratic 21st century benign version of the Ottoman Empire or the Habsburg Empire, where different ethnic groups got along peaceably because the loyalty was to the sovereign in Constantinople or in Vienna or a place like that. But here's the problem. The EU, because of its terrible economic crises of the past decade, going back to the Greek debt crisis, has no financial ability and no appetite to expand any further. So that these countries are stranded outside of the EU, and making real, authentic peace is going to be very, very hard to do, notwithstanding this positive transactional move of getting Serbia and Kosovo at the same table.
Great, yes. Now, considering Europe's most pressing problem right now, that in terms of what has led to many of the current convulsions, has been migration, international migration. And this is something which it somehow shares with the US, even though it has so many divergences. I'm wondering if you can comment on the migration phenomenon, and tapping into also some of Gersony's work in many of those countries from where you are seeing this drive for economic migration. Some would say there is also environmental causality to that, and this continues to be a major debate. I am actually working on a global assessment on migration and resources in my role with the UN International Resource Panel, which will be finished next year. So it will be especially very useful for me to get your insights on this. But where do you see the whole narrative around migration playing into the European larger sort of the empire issue that you're referring to? Some have even argued, I have read that some years ago, people said that, well, one way to solve it is to make North Africa also in some ways part of the European Union. Ultimately, that should be an aspiration. And then, you are able to keep the Africans on the African continent while they still feel they're in Europe. And this has been proposed every now and then. I'm wondering if you can comment on this whole migration dynamic in this regard, and perhaps also what Gersony might think of it too.
Yes, you've hit on a very crucial issue. The idea that North Africa should be part of the EU, sounds crazy today, but believe it or not, in the first decade of the 2000s and the 1990s, there was a big push that the spirit of the EU was to always expand and to take in contiguous areas. So there was associational agreements, like lower tier agreements with places even long before the Arab Spring, with Tunisia, with countries of the Middle East, because the aspiration of the EU after the collapse of the Berlin Wall was to expand, that Europe would not have real security unless it could stabilize all the countries on its periphery, which included North Africa. What you have now is the 21st century is going to continue to be the century of migration, of mass migration. It's happening for a complex of reasons. Let's take sub-Saharan Africa as an example. Sub-Saharan Africa is undergoing several things. One is there's a transportation revolution with railway, train. You can drive across the Sahara Desert now in bus caravans. The Sahara Desert has been conquered by technology, so to speak. The other is you have middle classes emerging everywhere in what I call the East Africa, Indian Ocean prosperity sphere, from Ethiopia and Djibouti south into Mozambique, in other words. So you have spots of big middle classes, Nigeria, South Africa, etc. But you also have state failure in quite a number of places. But here's the thing. The creation of middle classes doesn't keep people in place. It allows them to migrate. Because for the first time in their families' collective histories. They have the money, the financial wherewithal to leave where they presently live. And middle classes are notoriously ungrateful. They don't thank their governments for making them middle class. They tend to say, you know, we're better than this government, than this country where nothing works, where, you know, bureaucracy is a nightmare. You know, there'll be a better life for our children in Europe, and we can afford to go there now. You know, we can migrate north and cross the Mediterranean. So it's because sub-Saharan Africa is many stories developmentally wise. It's going to be a century of migration, where it used to be for every 6 Europeans, you had one sub-Saharan Africa. Now it's been reversed. And, you know, in terms of demographics, the European population is stable. It's not going anywhere. In some countries, it's even decreasing in population. Whereas sub-Saharan Africa, despite the fall in population growth, the demographic fall in relative population growth is still increasing dramatically in absolute numbers, especially among young people. So that while the growth of population is descending from 3% to 2% or whatever, the number of people that are being put on the earth in sub-Saharan Africa is still growing by larger amounts than anywhere else in the world. And so the result of all of this is that Europe is going to continue to be slowly, gradually deluged by an influx of sub-Saharan Africans. And we can play that out in the greater Middle East. We've seen because of the Syrian and Afghan war. But you won't need war to have constant migration from poorer areas to richer areas. And so this is going to really determine the European reality in the 21st century. Europe's going to have to become psychologically to define citizenship not by race or religion the way it has throughout its history, but through citizenship.
Indeed, yes. So let's stay for a moment with the continent of Africa. And clearly, you know, there are connections with Europe in terms of proximity and historical roots to colonialism. But with the United States also, Africa has this tragic historic connection to slavery and the diaspora here, the African diaspora. What do you see as America's responsibility in Africa, especially the way in which how Gersony operated there as part of the USAID platform? What should be, if you were to recommend, whichever government holds authority next year after the election, what should be the investment prioritization for Africa? And let me just put in one number, which recently I heard from Kristalina Georgieva from the IMF, which was that under the COVID pandemic, one thing which has come forward is that digital penetration in Africa is so low, whereas everyone else has been able to adapt to a lot of these issues in terms of at least the middle class working from home. You do not have high bandwidth internet. You need $60 billion. This is the number she gave, in order for all of sub-Saharan Africa to have high bandwidth internet so that they could adapt under these kinds of crises. Do you see the US playing a leadership role? Do you think it would be an important effort? Because Africa remains that one continent that has been left behind most.
Even with China's dramatic economic growth, the US is still the largest, most powerful economy in the world. And because the Cold War went on for so long, 4.5 decades, the US grew into essentially a leading world power. You know, it was essentially, the US made the world as it existed in 1989. And the US has responsibilities. You cannot lead unless you set a good example, in other words. This is true of empires going back to Rome, that the strongest, most vibrant empires were those that had a big idea. You know, if they had no idea, if it was purely cynical, the empire didn't do so well, you know? So it acted as an attractor force. And the one thing about alliances is they relieve the burden. You know, they relieve the burden off you. You know, so I think of alliances, I think of the UN, and I think of foreign aid like helping to build, you know, high bandwidth for internet in Africa as a way to relieve the burden on yourself. Because all these things work to keep people in place and keep them from migrating, to places that have a higher quality of life, etc. If you can make sub-Saharan Africa economically more vibrant, more places like Ethiopia, in other words, you know, in terms of economic development, you're going to get less refugees, less people banging at your doors trying to get in. So it's not, and also we live in an increasingly interconnected, claustrophobic, anxious world where every part of the world interacts with every other as never before. You can no longer say that this continent or this region is not strategic. Obviously there's a hierarchy of needs. Some places may be more important than the other. Some issues may be more important than the other. But nevertheless, every place now matters in a way that it didn't decades ago. And we first saw this during the Cold War, when because of the US-Soviet competition, USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, had offices in almost every sub-Saharan African country and had foreign aid programs, etc. Because of a transactional, opportunistic competition with the Soviets. Now there's competition with China. And if we don't do these things for sub-Saharan Africa or help lead the effort to do it through alliances, the Chinese will do it. And their interests and their power, economic, political, will flood through sub-Saharan Africa rather than America's. And so you have to ask yourself, would that be a better world? You see. So I believe that foreign aid, ecological aid, etc., falls within the rubric of national interest.
Indeed, yes. I would take it from your comments that the withdrawal of the US from the World Health Organization or UNESCO or other multilateral institutions, would that be possibly undermining that opportunity, or do you think the US can just do it bilaterally, that we do not need to go through some of these multilaterals?
Look, the UN and UN agencies have a lot of problems. At the top level, the UN power is based on the world order in 1945. So India is not a member of the Security Council, France is. All right. And UN agencies individually have problems, that have to do with the particular culture of the UN, etc. But the UN as a whole, if it didn't exist, we would have to invent it, because it's another way where you alleviate yourself of burdens. And, it's not a matter of more or less diplomacy. It's a matter of smart diplomacy. It's a matter of, you have problems with UNESCO, with the World Health Organization, admitted problems, you deal with them. You work through them. You use your pressure. You use your economic pressure, your political pressure to constructively reduce the scope of these problems rather than leaving altogether.
Yes, yeah. So I suppose definitely be critical, but don't just walk away, perhaps, would be the approach. Now, in terms of one particular institution that I wonder what Gersony's view would be and how you would critique it. Gersony spent a lot of time in Rwanda. And Rwanda is a country that, from an environmental perspective, some would argue has actually accomplished quite a bit. You know, they have protected areas for gorillas, they have a fairly high density population, but it's also a country which gets often critiqued in terms of democratic institutions and so on. What do you see as the Rwandan exceptionalism and as a case, and what has happened since the time Gersony worked there and the trajectory Rwanda has been? I'm wondering if you followed the country particularly, and if you could shed some light also on some of the institutions which were developed partly or further emboldened to deal with the terrible genocide that happened in Rwanda, such as the International Criminal Court, which has come under a lot of fire from the US recently.
Yes. The chapter on Rwanda in The Good American is the longest chapter in the book, along with the one on Mozambique. The chapter deals with basically an issue which continues today. When Gersony entered Rwanda, it was good guy, bad guy. You know, the Hutus had killed the Tutsis. You know, the Hutu-led government regime had killed 800,000 or so Tutsis. And so the Hutus were cast as the bad guy. And now you had a government, this is 1994 we're talking about, that was Tutsi-led. And that government was assumed to be just the good guys. Gersony's research discovered that this new Tutsi-led government was committing a mass murder of its own. Not a genocide, but a mass murder where 30,000 people, he estimated, had been killed. That's not on the scale of 800,000, but it still could not be tolerated. And at the time, nobody believed Gersony, but as time went on, everyone believed him, essentially. And this goes back to a problem which your question alludes to, which is the effective leader of that Tutsi-led government, Paul Kagame, was a real hard-edged, murderous authoritarian in his own right. But the international community did not see an alternative to his rule, because if he couldn't rule, who could? An authoritarian system, the way their logic went, was still better than chaos, and that was true. And that's proved to be the case through the decades. On the one hand, Kagame has run a very authoritarian regime that has violated many human rights. But on the other hand, he's provided effective administration to allow this quality of life and standard of living of Rwanda to improve by leaps and bounds. Which nobody else probably could have done. Remember, when we're talking about Rwanda, we're not talking about West Africa. Rwanda is an incredibly institutionalized, highly governed place, and always was, essentially. So Gersony identified a problem, that Kagame is a killer. The international community identified a problem. Yes, but what do you want? Chaos? We have to build from someplace. We have to rebuild from someplace. And so we have this moral conundrum today in 2020 where Kagame is still in power. His record of an economic institutional achievement has been fantastic. But the human rights situation, speaking your own mind, is very, very problematic. Now, Thomas Hobbes would say that, order comes before freedom, because without order, there's no freedom for anybody. Kagame brought order to Rwanda to allow people to live their daily lives. And what the founding fathers said was, once you have order, then the issue is making order less and less oppressive as time goes on, to make order civil and liberal. And Rwanda still has that road to climb.
Indeed. And what are your views on the International Criminal Court?
Oh, yes.
Partly...
I forgot that. Yeah, the International Criminal Court is a great, it's a great organization and it's a great idea and it has done a lot of good. But there's, again, another conundrum with it. Because of the existence of the International Criminal Court, dictators know they can be pursued anywhere. And so it used to be you didn't like a dictator, you gave him a villa in the south of France or something. You bought him off, you bought him asylum, and he would leave and everyone would be happier that he left and the country would get to normal. And he would be living in some place in exile in comfort. In comfort. This is like Saudi Arabia gave Idi Amin exile for many decades. France gave Jean-Claude Duvalier exile for many years from Haiti. But because of the International Criminal Court, you won't trust any asylum deal if you're a dictator, because you can go anywhere and the International Criminal Court will still go after you. And your only protection is the regime that invited you in to live in exile. And if the politics of that regime change, you don't even need a change of regime, but just the politics within the regime change, suddenly you're on a plane to The Hague, to the International Criminal Court. So there's a problem with the International Criminal Court. But on the whole, it's a great organization, it's a good idea. But we have to find a way around this problem because it's going to be harder and harder to buy off dictators, to get them out of the country, in other words.
Excellent. Thanks for your candor on that as well. Now we've got some questions coming through. We have about 15 minutes to go, so I thought we'd go to some of the questions from the audience. So one question which comes from Murray Levin is, when you see alt-right movements in Germany and France and elsewhere in the EU, could you envisage a future where the democratic-leaning EU would become itself an almost fascist bloc?
I don't see it becoming a fascist bloc. What I see it becoming, what a danger of the EU is that it will become too comfortable, too pure. It will want to keep out any outsider that threatens even mildly the standard of living, and the EU could evolve into a place of countries that are, where identity is still by religion and ethnic group only, national identity. And so the EU is kind of a perfect utopia inside, but all around its borders is chaos and poverty and disillusion also. But the question hits on a very, very important point, which is if we're going to have a century of gradual migration from the developing world into the EU, continuing, if we're going to have migrants continuing to bang at the doors of the EU, that's going to fuel an alt-right movement. That's going to fuel populist movement, because you're always going to have a significant sector of the population, not only in Germany, but in other places, that simply won't want immigrants at all. So the more pressure for immigration, the better populists tend to do in elections. So that's a real challenge for the EU. This evolution to defining who is a Frenchman or who is a German that is based on knowledge of the language, but not necessarily on religion or ethnic group. That was the American model. The old American model was you had to learn English. You came from outside, you weren't put in Spanish language schools, you were forced to learn English, cold turkey. And if you spoke English, you were a citizen. You were, psychologically speaking, a citizen. But it didn't matter your ethnicity or your original language. That has to become more of a model for the EU going forward, because migration is not going to ease up.
But just to keep on that point, then within the US, though, we have seen also a similar shift in terms of concerns about cultural dilution and so on. do you see America having some opportunity for still adhering to that pluralism of migration and assimilation in a more diverse way than Europe, or do you see us moving also more towards Europe in some way?
The US was always more diverse than Europe and always had a more flexible, emotional, psychological attitude towards citizenry. There were always tensions going back to when Germans immigrated to the United States in the 19th century, and Catholic Italians, people thought that America was dissolving, even then. And of course, in the 20th century, America has evolved so much where it really is a sort of form of international civilization, but it has tensions. It has real tensions. I think most Americans want, firm, hard, defensible borders, but they don't want to be cruel to people at the same time. They want to fix the border problem, not build up walls, but have firm, entry procedures where, no American likes the idea, or very few Americans like the idea of many illegal immigrants. But that doesn't mean they're against legal immigration. So I think that there is clearly a middle ground that can be found that's for hard, defensible borders, but is also not cruel to anyone and gives a reasonable number of people the right to immigrate. Remember, in America's history, there were always vast waves of immigration, followed by decades when there was no immigration at all because of populist backlash. So historically, this is not really new, what's going on now.
Indeed, but the structural aspects of the American experiment are such that you feel that we will be able to still return to that trajectory towards a more diverse, pluralistic system down the road. And I would also add to the mixed countries like Canada and Australia, which is one of my other countries of citizenship, that have been struggling similarly, but have followed, slightly different model, which some would say is very much driven by economic necessity, and that's why they have a point-based immigration system, whereas the US has had a much more family-oriented immigration system. And there's been this tension whether are you just getting people here because you want to make them pay taxes, or are you getting them here because you want to create community?
Yeah, that tension is going to continue because clearly in a high-tech age, we live in a technological century to a greater degree than any other. And in this high-tech age, there's going to be a premium of wanting to let the best software engineers, the most talented high-tech people from Israel, India, you name it, wherever, to allow them to immigrate and work in Silicon Valley or wherever. Because if for national security reasons, make these people American citizens and have them bring their genius to American tech companies. But at the same time, throughout American history, even during periods when we were much less internationalist, than we were during the Cold War and the decades after, there was always a humanitarian element that didn't exist to the same degree in European countries.
Great. So a few more questions, which I'll try to bundle up. One question from Bob Turgeson is the comments on the Chinese taking up the slack for lack of ongoing American involvement in Africa. What are your views in terms of how America has played this game over the last 50 years? What key actions or mindsets must the US undergo to get back into the game?
Yeah. First of all, the U.S. game in sub-Saharan Africa during the Cold War was foreign aid to a significant degree, but it was altruistic foreign aid, but not very well thought through. And so a lot of the foreign aid was wasted. It would have been better spent trying to develop individual businesses and economies rather than just give things to people. Then the U.S. Relationship with sub-Saharan Africa became purely military. And that's where it's evolved now. You have weakly governed states provide like breathing room for world international terrorist outfits. So our foreign aid consisted of Green Berets and Marine companies, training indigenous African forces to patrol their region better, to patrol their country's borders better. Military aid, though, is one-dimensional. And these military, not battalion size, but company and platoon size elements who were dispersed throughout sub-Saharan Africa were basically not in cities at all. They were in the borderlands, in the periphery, so that as sub-Saharan Africans who live mainly in cities never saw these people. They were completely unaware of what the Americans were doing, even if they were doing good things. Whereas the Chinese aid, building railroads, building roads, building a sports stadium, for instance, was upfront and close and personal, and people were viscerally aware of what China was doing and not aware at all in many cases what the United States was doing. To get back in the game, the United States has to make more full-bodied its engagement with sub-Saharan Africa, in terms of not just aid, but business investment, etc., so that it's palpable, it's visually palpable to sub-Saharan Africans. And that's a challenge for us, because outside of sub-Saharan Africa, throughout Eurasia, China's Belt and Road Initiative is really about big projects. It's about building big ports, highways, pipelines, train stations, things that people can see, things on which can jumpstart an economy. If you have a big airport or a state-of-the-art modern port, that jumpstarts an economy. And the Chinese have become great at this. It's a great age in history to be a Chinese civil engineer, I can tell you. This has not been the American approach. The American approach has to become more attuned to doing things that average people in these countries will see and will have an effect on their lives for the better.
Indeed, I remember visiting University of Kinshasa in DRC many years ago, and that was built by American funds during the Cold War. And everyone remembers that this was built by the Americans partly. But even though things have changed in terms of how US aid has played out since then, but absolutely the impact of infrastructure, if it is done well, makes a difference.
Let me give you an example. Something after the Iraq War, the U.S. Agency in International Development went into Iraq in a big way to rebuild Iraq. And initially they made big mistakes because they kind of adopted the Soviet approach. They built big electrical facilities way out of town, which had no effect because they didn't work very well. Well, what Iraqis wanted in their towns and villages was to get rid of the smell of human excrement, because sewers had clogged up. And so AID officials were pleading with the American military, stop building these big things. And, if you can just get rid of this terrible smell in these slum areas, you're going to win hearts and minds. That's the way to do it.
Absolutely. Getting that insight from the communities in terms of needs assessment. So there are two questions which are somewhat related, so I'll wrap them together. And they're about institutionalizing Gersony's legacy. Whether he had supporters at one time in the Pentagon and in Congress who were able to sort of champion his cause. And the questions from Nicholas Guasdev and also from Lawrence Husick pertain to, what are the institutions now? Are there people like Gersony who can still continue to work, because we have some resilience in the system, even with the political cycles that are there, to continue his work?
Yes and no. Remember, I've written a biography, and a biography by definition is about an extraordinary individual, or else why write it? And Gersony had several extraordinary qualities that normally don't go together in a human being. He was a dedicated humanitarian, but he was a conservative. He believed in, he was a former commodity trader, a former Vietnam veteran. So he had this practical mathematical approach to refugee work, which allowed him to solve problems and come up with analyses of political situations on the ground, which were very uncomfortable to listen to. In the State Department or USAID, but people trusted him because he was clearly a practically minded person who had no illusions about how the way the world worked. Really, it's hard to find these kind of people, and when you do, they tend to do very well in the humanitarian field because they're very good organizers, etc. The problem with Washington is that the State Department and USAID has, over the decades, delegated a lot of what Gersony did, and I go into this in depth in the book, to what are called Beltway bandits. These massive consulting firms who send like a team of 15 people who are prone to groupthink and avoid the most difficult questions often and charge a lot of money. And this has been the syndrome in Washington. So you've got to, Gersony pleads in the book, you've got to get back to AID taking direct responsibility for its aid projects rather than just giving the money to a relief organization or a Beltway bandit, in other words. The way things have evolved has kind of forced out people like Gersony and someone else who died in Chechnya in 1995, Fred Cuny, who's also a character in the book, who is a much more famous relief specialist than Gersony. That's why I've written the book, to kind of, to give Gersony his credit. But Fred Cuny was similar to Gersony in that he was a lone operator who managed to get bureaucracies to do the right thing.
Okay, great. So we're coming to the end of the hour, but maybe we'll try to squeeze in one question that will hopefully sort of sum things up a bit. And that's about sort of the, the efficacy of aid from Matthew Gallagher's. While aid can indeed facilitate development, which boosts soft power, aid giving to corrupt and transitioning governments is an imperfect practice. Specifically, what are the best approaches for addressing the fungibility of this problem of aid?
Yeah, the very definition of a corrupt government is a government in a country, usually, though not always, but usually with very weak institutions, because it's weak government institutions that lead to corruption in the first place. What is corruption? It's an alternative pathway, an alternative way of getting something done, because the official bureaucratic pathways don't work, because of weak institutions. So corruption is part of the process of development. And Sam Huntington wrote about this in depth in his book, Political Order in Changing Societies, almost over 50 years ago. He identified this problem. So you can't simply be pure, we won't do anything for this country because its government is corrupt. That's the easy way out. You have to find a way to work with the government. And if it's corrupt, you don't dump a lot of money on them, obviously. You do small projects with accountability, and you build up from there. But corruption is merely part of the process of development.
Indeed, yeah, that's a pragmatic approach to it, and recognizing human nature as it is. Well, thank you so much for sharing these insights, your personal experience, and a preview of your book, which will be, I believe, ready in a few months. It should be released.
January 26th is the publication date.
Fantastic. So it's been a real pleasure, Bob. I look forward to further interactions through FPRI. Rolly, would you like to close the session then?
Thank you. That was a remarkable discussion, prodigious both depth and breadth. I'm stunned. Actually, I'm not stunned. It's what I've come to expect of Bob Kaplan, and I'm assuming what we'll be getting from Professor Ali as well. So a special thank you to both of you and to the University of Delaware for becoming a part of this joint partnership, and a special tip of the hat thank you to Bob Torgeson as well for bringing the two communities together, and to our FPRI supporters. For those of you who are new to FPRI, I encourage you to take a look at our website. We have articles, we have videos of most of our past events, including this one will be up in a day or two. And so please come check us out. Consider becoming a member. Thank you again to our guests today, and to University of Delaware and FPRI, and we'll see you. Take care.
Thank you, Salim. Thank you. It was a great discussion.